Good evening all, and welcome. Before the video begins, I want to give a special shout out to a very active and special member of the community, Aimseekins. Tomorrow, Valentine's Day, she is having some serious surgery done, and I would like to extend the very best of luck and hope that everything goes well and for a speedy recovery. She's always replying in the comments section, and so if you'd like to wish her good luck, feel free to drop her a message too. But without further ado, it's time for you all to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. It was the first Tuesday of the Pennsylvania deer season, December 3rd, 2013. I've always been an avid hunter, and I would wake up very early in the morning to get into the woods before daylight. I would be in the woods by 4:30 in the morning. Having to hunt on state game lands meant beating other people into the woods to get a decent spot. When I got to the parking area at around 4:15, no one else was there. So I walked into the woods, not using a flashlight, but walking only by moonlight. I walked through a field into the tree line and started on my path to my spot. I came to an intersection in the path. One way went left and down the mountain. The other way went right. I went right because my spot was on the other side. Roughly 50 yards after making the right-hand turn, I smelled what I can only describe as hot garbage. It hit me in the face. Hot dumpster juice in the middle of August. So I stopped dead, turned on my flashlight, expecting to see piles and piles of garbage. Nothing. No garbage. Nothing dead. Just hot garbage smell. Keep in mind this is in December. It's cold out. High 20s to low 30s. So even if there was garbage, it shouldn't smell that bad. So I kind of thought nothing of it. I followed the path to my spot, which was down over the ridge from the garbage smell. Roughly maybe 40 feet down, that leads into a grass field where I would sit. I set up my seat, get settled in for about 2 minutes. That's when rocks started coming down the ridge. The first rock startled me, causing me to turn on my light again, scanning the field, hoping to see eye reflection of a deer, but nothing was there. I sat back down. Another rock comes down the ridge. This time I stand up and go out into the grass field with flashlight and the pistol that I carry while hunting. I scanned again. Nothing. And purposely waited in the field for about 5 minutes. Now I'm getting angry, assuming another hunter is messing with me because I'm in their spot. I sit down again. The third rock, sounding larger than the others, comes tumbling down the ridge. I don't get up this time. Not 2 minutes after that, another rock, not tumbled, but sounded as though it were thrown off the ridge and landed in the field. Screw it. I'm pissed. I gathered up my gear and started back up the trail to the ridge. I get on top of the ridge, scanning with my light the whole time. Nothing. No eyes. No other hunter. I get to the spot where I smelled the hot garbage. Nothing. The smell is gone. Finally, it clicked in my head. It may have not been another person. Possibly something else. I've heard other stories of people's Bigfoot experiences, a lot of which remark on how bad the smell is. Screw that. I all but ran out of the woods, and to top it all off, no other vehicles were in the parking area when I got out of the woods. This took place in Pennsylvania State Game Lands 229, outside of Tremont in Schuylkill country. I later come to find out that a co-worker of mine had actually seen a bipedal cross in front of his car within 2 miles of my location, so maybe they're real. I don't know. But I definitely had an experience that I will not forget. This happened a few years ago at my parents' house, in a small town in Wayne County. Anyone that knows the area knows some parts are very rural. Well, my parents live right in town, not far from the center of it, but in a weird spot. The town has only maybe 500 people in the town limits, and it's surrounded by farmland and forests. They live right near the railroad tracks and canal, and the backyard is pitch black at night because the street lights don't reach back there. The yard backs up to a walking trail and woods. It's actually pretty creepy back there after dark, even though it's 2 blocks from downtown. The night this story takes place, it was extremely dark. I think it was a new moon, or a moonless night, and it was overcast to boot. Late summer or early fall, so it was pretty dry, no mud to capture any footprints. My parents, brother and I were talking in the living room, at the front of the house, the part of the house facing town and light. The house is kind of long and skinny, maybe 30 by 40 feet wide, but probably 120 to 150 feet long. As we're talking, the family dog stood up and looked around and started to growl really low. He was a yellow lab of about 90 pounds, half deaf and blind from diabetes. Overall, he was a really chill dog. He'd never barked at other dogs, and very rarely barked at people. That's what made this so odd. His cackles went up, and he started barking towards the back of the house. There were at least 2 closed doors before you even got to the room where the back door is. The dog is now like full-on berserk, barking at the closed door in the hallway. We opened it and followed him to see why he was going nuts. We get to the door to the back room and are now worried someone has broken in. But when we opened it, Marley shot straight to the back door, jumping and barking and snarling, making sounds I've never heard this big baby of a dog make. I opened the back door and he tried to bolt out. He was going to attack whoever or whatever was there. Me and my parents step out on the back porch and close Marley inside. He still sounds almost rabid. We wait for a second for our eyes to adjust because the backyard is pitch black. We see a silhouette, maybe 40 or 50 feet away, standing at the edge of the yard right near the railroad tracks access road. Now, to say this was big is an understatement. It was way over 6 feet tall, probably closer to 7.5 or 8, and extremely broad. I'd think it was a potential burglar that we caught sneaking up to the house, if it wasn't so colossal. My parents to this day swear it was a black bear. Officially, according to the DEC, black bears don't live anywhere near this area and haven't for a long time. Also, the size of it would have been a record-sized bear. The reaction of my dog going nuts doesn't seem like what a bear would do. After we had put Marley inside, it just stood there, upright, for about 2 minutes, before we decided it was best to go inside, as the hairs on the back of our necks were standing up. The reason it freaked me out was even at the distance it was at, you could hear it breathe. Deep, raspy breaths. It sounded like it was breathing right next to my ear. They were slow and steady, not like someone who was out of breath. It wasn't like they were trying to make their breath sound loud. It just was. I immediately went to find a flashlight. But when I got back outside, whatever it was gone. No tracks, no fur, just a huge silhouette that was too big to be a person, but acted unlike any wild animal that I have ever seen. I was walking into a spot where I duck hunt. It had snowed several days before and had frozen and thawed a few times, so there was a really thick crust on the snow. I'm a big guy and could easily walk on top without breaking through. As I walked along a farm path, I heard something in the forest to my right. Looking, I noticed a shape maybe 30 yards away trying to hide behind a tree line. I could see it clearly. It kept sliding to the left and peering around the tree trunk. I stopped and turned towards it, and it turned and ran away downhill, crossed the upper end of the frozen beaver pond breaking through the ice, crossed an open field on the other side and disappeared into the woods. I lost sight of it before it broke through the ice. It scared me. Shaking, I drew my pistol and made my way back into the field on the far side of the beaver pond and looked at the muddy tracks where it came out of the water. There were just smudges. It wasn't even denting the packed forest snow. I went down to the water and looked at the broken ice. It was thick enough for me to stand on, and I tried. I went back to the tree that I was trying to hide behind, and there was a limb that was across its face, so I knew I could get a height estimate. That limb was even with the top of my head when I was standing, where it had stood. I'm 6 foot, so this thing must have been at least 6'6" or taller. What was it? It was bipedal, standing at 6'6". Maybe it was a person. What could possibly make a human cross a frozen pond in cold 10-degree Fahrenheit weather, not knowing if the ice would support them or not, or even how deep the water was? Then, when did this now very wet person go in a 300-acre forest? There is still a logical explanation. I just don't know what it is. I grew up in the great Pacific Northwest, in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, under the shadow of Mount St. Helens in Washington State. It is a land full of myth and legend, mostly from the natives, but a lot from the old-timers, the loggers, the trappers, and hunters. One of my father's oldest and dearest friends, now passed on, was a local Native American who was one of the oldest of his nation. He was an adult before most of the towns in the area were settled by white people. His name was Charlie to us. I'm sure he had another native name, but I don't recall what it was. Charlie used to sit us down, kids and adults, and tell us stories. Some of the stories were tribal legends. Some of them were things he swore happened to him in the woods, and some of the things said by the other men and women of his tribe were the fur trappers and miners of the late 19th century. As I got older, I began to realize that Charlie wasn't pulling our legs on some of these stories. He genuinely believed them. And a few of them happened to me, as I would wander out into the woods and investigate. The most obvious and easiest to prove was the ridge light or mountain lights. Charlie called them by different names, and the locals to this day still tell some of the stories about them. The lights, according to Charlie, had existed as far back as man had. They would appear around the mountains on clear nights and zip around in the air. One of the local legends said that the lights were the spirits dancing and playing. I first saw the lights when I was a kid, and several times since then. To me, they fit the exact description of a classic UFO. Lights that appear to be some form of aircraft that flew in manners impossible for current aircrafts, incredible speeds, and course corrections. The last time I saw the ridge lights was in the mid-90s. I have noticed a distant decrease in reported sightings of them since then. But for a while, the western foothills of the Cascades were a hotspot for UFO sightings. Speaking of UFOs, it goes on a bit further than just seeing the lights. When I was a young kid, I woke up in the middle of the night, in the little farmhouse we lived in, to bright lights outside. They were multicolored and flashing, like police cars, except I seemed to recall they were green as well. I curiously and unafraid walked out of my room and into the living room, the kitchen, and eventually my parents' room. All the while, in all the windows, there were these bright lights. I tried to wake my parents up, but they were sound asleep. I shrugged it off and went to bed, and woke up in the morning. When I brought it up with my parents, they dismissed it as a dream. I accepted that, especially because one odd part of my story, I couldn't wake my father up, and he was a Vietnam vet who normally woke up at the sound of a mosquito farting. This story would have ended there if not for our drunken neighbour. Some years later, when I was a teen, I was talking with the now dead neighbour's granddaughter. The neighbour himself was known as a drunken lout and storyteller of the first order. Anyway, his granddaughter was telling me about how he used to tell these crazy stories, and one day he swore up and down that aliens landed in his field and visited him in the middle of the night. I laughed and said, I think I would have seen that, as our yard is connected to his field. She agreed, saying something like, you and your parents would have noticed a bunch of red, green and blue and white flashing lights in your backyard 10 years ago. To be clear, I am not saying I saw a UFO land near my house. I'm saying I have seen lights that matched the description of the lights on the supposed spaceship reporting to have landed in my unreliable, drunken neighbour's yard. And then there's the big myth of them all. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you call him. Do I believe he exists? Absolutely. Even though I consider myself a man who puts science before superstition. Why do I believe in him? Because when I was a child, I saw the footprints. My father even had a plaster cast of one. That was my first encounter. The prints were on the edge of a bed creek, in a small ravine on a piece of wild property my father owned. We found them when surveying the property with a hunter friend. My father insisted it must be Bigfoot, to which the hunter scoffed, and said a man could have made those prints. To demonstrate, this 6'6", 250-pound hunter climbed on a nearby log, took off his boots, and jumped down into the semi-soft ground. His foot size was 12, and made about a ½ inch indent into the earth next to the other print. The print was a hand longer than the hunter's, and at least 1½ inches down. It also had an odd big toe. It was splayed to the side, kind of like a thumb. My dad consulted Charlie for advice. Charlie told him to leave Sasquatch be, and Sasquatch would leave us be. Charlie also told us how he knew when Sasquatch was nearby. Nothing else would be, and sometimes you could smell him. He said that if you could smell Sasquatch, it was time to get the hell out, because he was a hell of a lot closer than you wanted him to be. Anyway, as the years went by, we learned to just hike out of the woods if they got dead quiet and we didn't see any signs of other animals. Only twice do I think I smelt him. Both times it was a heavy, musty, almost mouldy odour, like old sweat or wet dog. The second time I was with a girlfriend. This was in my teen years, and I recalled something else that Charlie has said. Never go into Sasquatch territory with a woman who was on her period, because he could smell that and would track her, according to legend, to find a mate. It was the first time I ever asked a girl if she was on her period. She was. Needless to say, quite embarrassed to answer that it was that time of the month. That was when I told her we needed to leave now, and we started out of the woods. We both swore we heard sticks breaking and branches rustling behind us the entire way out, and we both had that terrifying pit in your stomach you get when you know that something is watching you. Stories of the Alaskan Bushmen, or Tornits, have been told since the first humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge. In the beginning, the story goes the Inuit and Tornits lived peacefully in villages near each other and shared common hunting ground. The Inuit people often built and used kayaks for hunting, while the Tornits were unable to master the building of kayaks. They were very aware of the advantages of having and using one. One story goes that a young Tornit borrowed a young Inuit's kayak without permission and damaged the bottom of it. The young Inuit became very angry and stabbed the Tornit in the nape of the neck while he was sleeping, killing him. The rest of the Tornits feared that they too would be killed by the Inuit and fled the country, rarely to be seen again. Since that time, many stories have come out of the bush of hunters disappearing, later found dead and mangled, or never seen again. Apparently, hunters and the Tornits no longer peacefully shared common ground. Every spring, my family and the Panillo clan, a Hawaiian family we were very close to, would pack up and head to Willow for a week to fish for salmon in the Deshka and Little Sustinna rivers. One particularly rainy and cold spring, my father, brother and I were pulling in salmon after salmon when a nasty, skunky, musty smell floated towards us. It suddenly dawned on me that most of the other fishing families had quietly and quickly disappeared. Mr. Panillo always fished with a shotgun by his side. My own father was always armed with a Colt .45, and now he unsnapped the holster and quietly told us to reel in our gear and pack up. Since we'd only been fishing for about an hour, and it wasn't anywhere near dark, all of us kids were a little bit confused. But knowing not to question our dads when they gave us an order, we did as we were told. I whispered to my dad asking what was wrong. He whispered back, "Bear." But I wasn't so sure. I had never smelled a bear like that. As we were crossing over the railroad bridge, I remember looking at some trees that had been uprooted and then stuck in the ground upside down. I often wondered why and how someone could do that. I learned many years later that it was a telltale sign of Bigfoot territory. I guess I'll never know if it was a bear or a Bigfoot that displaced us all from fishing that evening. But I do know that it was the last time our families ever fished that river. It was also the first and only time all the kids got to sleep, or at least tried to, in the camp trailer instead of the tents. This experience takes place about 4 years ago at my parents' house. The house has a fairly long driveway that goes down to the mailbox. We live in a wooded area with a forest on both sides of the house and behind as well. On top of that, we live on a dead-end road with only a few houses, so it's quiet, dark, and isolated at night. It was about 10 at night when I was on my way down to get the mail. A few months before this, my mum had told me about strange sounds she heard in the woods behind the house early one morning. She said that she was taking the dog out to go to the bathroom, and she heard what she described as a hooting sound like a monkey in the woods. My mum is one of the most level-headed and down-to-earth people I've ever met. She does not believe in anything paranormal, but she told me that she immediately thought of Bigfoot, and it freaked her out. So fast forward, back to the night of getting to the mail. I get to the end of the driveway, and I hear this sound coming back from the woods down the road, and it's something I've never heard. I've lived here my entire life, and I've heard everything that lives in these woods. But this was something that I have no comparison for, except a howler monkey with a deep voice. It made a kind of ooh and ah sound, like it was hooting, that increased in volume and intensity with every hoot. It reminded me of the primate house at the zoo. I immediately thought of my mother's experience and hauled ass back towards the house. Right before heading inside, I paused again, listening to see if I could hear it, and I heard the same sound, in the woods, right in front of me about 20 feet in. I can't tell you how much of a chill went down my spine. Whatever it was had followed me through the woods without making a sound. I ran inside to get my brother, who believes in the paranormal, but is skeptical of most stories. I told him to get out here, and that he needed to hear this. You just have to hear it. He rolled his eyes and followed me out. So my brother and I stood in the front of the house, listening to this thing hoot and yell in the woods in front of us. Suddenly, another one answered from across the yard in the woods on the other side of the house, and the trees began shaking in the exact same area. I can't express to you the size of these things just by listening to them. They sounded huge, and the one behind the house was violently shaking the trees. My brother is very stoic and not easily impressed, and he stood there silently with me listening to these two things shouting at each other in the woods, and after several minutes, he quietly said, "What is that?" I whispered back, "I have no idea." My mum later told me that she said it scared the crap out of him. That's the only time I've ever heard this sound, which to me gives it more weight as a strange experience. I've had people try and tell me that I heard 2 owls. I have lived in the woods my entire life, and I've heard owls many times. This was not an owl. I used to enjoy going for early morning walks as the sun came up. I don't do that anymore. A couple of days ago, my grandma told me a story that happened to her. When she was around 8, she lived in a small house with her sisters and parents. It was in the middle of a large field, and it had trees surrounding it towards the back. There was only a narrow dirt road that connected them to the outside world. One night in May of 1964, she and her sisters had went to sleep for the night. She woke about 2 hours after she fell asleep and got the horrible feeling that she was being watched. They had a small window 6 feet up on their wall in the room. She turned and looked at it and saw 2 glowing eyes. She got really scared, so she woke up one of her sisters. Her sister began to freak out, and she hid under the blanket. They sat there until the eyes left the window. The next day, they told their mother about the incident, and she didn't believe them. That was until they investigated the outside. There were enormous footprints leading to the window and then back out into the woods. From that point on, my grandmother and her sister were not allowed to play near the woods. A couple of months later, they heard from a neighbor who lived about 7 miles away. He said he lost a couple of cows. He had no idea where they went. There was no blood or body, and the fence was undamaged. It was almost like something had just carried them away. After she told me about this story, I think she may have had a Bigfoot encounter. So I had decided to go out looking for some mushrooms, the edible kind. I was probably about 20 miles on a back road, which is just a dirt road marked as a trail XYZ here. I found an out-of-the-way spot to park my vehicle, where I know some good mushroom hunting can be found. After a little searching in a ravine, I found a good spot, and set up a tent and built a basic campfire. I was out there 2 days before the incident. On the third morning, I got up to nature's call and walked off a bit to relieve myself. It was still pretty early, dawnish. I about tripped on this rock, and it was huge. I didn't remember seeing it there when I went to set up camp. I got an odd feeling, because there were similar-sized rocks all touching each other. The reptile part of my brain was screaming. So I went and got my flashlight to check out these rocks. They formed, as far as I could tell, a perfect circle around my campsite. From memory, I'd say it was about a 15 to 20 foot diameter ring. I paced it off. The thing is, I could barely make these rocks budge. Sure, I could lift one, maybe just a few inches, but move them? No. They were about knee-high. Some of them had to be in over 100-meter range. In a moment of crystal clarity, I realized that if crap hit the fan, my vehicle would be found, but I wouldn't be. I don't think I've broken camp quite so quickly. I didn't even get the few mushrooms I had collected. I figured it would be better to leave them for whatever left me the ring of stones. I was such deeply troubled by this that I have not spent one night in the woods in the 5 or so years since this happened. A lot of people think I'm making this up, but it happened. I have my theories as to what it was. One, I can't talk about, because it has to do with Native American beliefs, of which I am one. But the other I will. As far as I know, Sasquatch has never been sighted in my area. I mean, we have the Fouquet monster, but that's a couple of hours south of me. I've heard some stories when I was younger, around the hunting campfire, that there is something big living in the mountainous parts of Arkansas. These were old men telling the story 20 years ago. They say in turn that they saw the creature or heard them in their youth. One even talked about hearing roaring around his hunting cabin and a loud crash. The next day, most of the young trees had been splintered or pulled up, so I 100% believe that there is something out there. This is a story passed down to me from my late father. He was an avid storyteller, and often told this story when he was drunk, but never when he was sober. This happened to him when he was a young lad, maybe 40 years ago now. He and his girlfriend at the time had gotten into a huge fight and broken up. His friend Jack told him the only way to console him would be to have a night around the campfire in the woods. On their way there, Jack drove my father into the woods and parked at a spot where no one else was stationed. They took their gear in through the darkness and found a spot about 20 minutes away from where they'd left the car. It was quiet and a peaceful night, with the moon shining brightly over their heads, illuminating the canopy of trees above them and the foliage beneath them. Their spot was quite bare, perfect to start a campfire and to set up their tent. They whipped out the beers and started drinking and having general merry conversation. My father confided in Jack all the things that happened to deteriorate the relationship. and as a 20-year-old man, he was quite upset. Jack did his best to reassure him, and as the beers kept flowing in, the night seemed to get better, and the thoughts of this girl breaking my father's heart were slowly being washed away by the alcohol. I believe my father said he was around on his 5th beer, although truth be told, he usually does lose count. He said that something was off. That whole evening, they'd been happy by the roaring fire, eating their snacks, drinking their alcohol, with the pleasant little buzz of the forest in the background, the chirps, the noises, the general background hum made from everything in the forest. It was almost like the sound had been turned off. One moment it was there, and the next it was just their voices and the crackling of the fire. It got very creepy, and it seemed as though the world was slightly darker again. They looked around and didn't see anything. There was no cause for concern, not anything immediately apparent anyway. So they sat there, just seeing their surroundings. Like I said, the moonlight gave plenty of illumination, so they could very clearly see what was around them, but saw nothing. Why did all the sounds stop, they wondered. They sat there in silence for a little bit, debating whether or not it were important for them to do something, like leave, or if they should just stay, and that the animals are just being weird. Their thought process didn't take all that long. Not long after the sounds had disappeared, did a foul stench appear from nowhere. This was before the movie Shrek came out. No. My father compared it to leaving food to rot out in the sun and then having to take a good old whiff of it from up close. He said the odor was so pungent that it infested their noses and that they wanted to leave straight away. With all the weirdness that was going on, they were starting to get uncomfortable. So my father thanked his friend for making him feel better, and they both agreed to go back to his house to finish off the last few beers and just to have a general chilled night. They started packing everything up when they heard something in the distance. They weren't entirely sure what it was, like a crackling, like twigs snapping. They thought it could be another person. Could another person smell that bad? So they yelled out and asked them to come forward, that they had beer that they'd like to share, and to generally just have a chill night. No one stepped forward. The sounds stopped, and they waited patiently awaiting a reply. They didn't get one, so they quickly packed up their stuff and started hauling it back to the car. They didn't hear anything on their run back, but just as they were driving away, the headlights illuminated something, what appeared to be eyes in the forest. The eyes, however, were far too high to be a person. They could see the outline of some kind of creature, humanoid, standing anywhere between 6 to 8 feet high, immobile. They drove away and tried not to think about it. The reason this incident stuck out in my father's head, it was because he was traumatized from breaking up with his first love, and then this happens on the same night. Talk about bad luck double whammy. He never went into more detail than that, but I always wonder, did my dad have an encounter with the elusive Bigfoot? I'm going to try and give as many details as possible. I live in Ohio around Youngstown, and my family owns a cabin in Pennsylvania near the Allegheny Forest. It's my grandpa's cabin, and he's a retired firefighter. Years ago, he and his firefighter friends would go hunting in the forest. His friends stayed in a tree stand, while the rest were spread out amongst the property in various stands. Around lunchtime, they planned to meet up and eat. Calling the friend, he wouldn't answer for anyone over any sort of walkie-talkie or anything. They decided to meet up and go check on him. They found him petrified, hiding duck down in the stand. They said small trees looked like they'd been snapped with ease. He was as white as a ghost. He claimed there was a large, estimated 8-foot tall humanoid creature that stunk so bad he had been tearing down trees left, right and center and walked under the stand, so tall his head almost touched it. He had no idea what it was, and in all his years of hunting, he had never seen anything like it. He didn't know what to think of it. My grandpa is very skeptical, and wouldn't make up this story for no reason whatsoever. It just makes you think. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed tonight's installment of stories. Bigfoot stories are always quite creepy. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to show it some love by dropping a like and leaving a comment with what you thought of it. If you're new here, why not stick around? Subscribe and press the little bell icon to be updated every time I post, which is every night. If there's a story that you would like to share and have read on the channel, feel free to send it to my email or post it on my Reddit page. Either are fine. Just please be sure to include plenty of punctuation, paragraphing, as well as description, as this will maximize the chances of it being read. What I mean is, if your story is about 4 paragraphs long, think about injecting some detail. Can you make it better? Can you set the scene to make everything a bit clearer? That always helps. Just some food for thought. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.